Meanwhile, in the SEC, LSU at Auburn. This is always a spotlight game in the SEC. In fact, I was trying to think, and I still don't know, I think it's been 6 years since I missed this game in person. I'm at this game every year. And so, boy, we've been on the field for some classics. 2 out of the last 3 years, LSU has come from double-digit deficits to win this game. I think they got 3 in a row right now against Auburn. Auburn played them really close last year, played them about as close as anyone did, including Alabama, including Oklahoma, including Clemson. So both teams right now, and this is the 3:30 Eastern CBS game of the week, by the way, LSU favored by 3. Both teams are on such roller coasters. It's only week 6. We're halfway through a season. It feels like you've seen an entire season's worth of ups and downs with both of these teams. So it's always important to understand what the undercurrent is. You can read headlines, you can look at things from a blimp 50,000 feet in the air. I don't recommend flying your blimp that high, but it's your blimp. You do what you want to with it. But the undercurrent, what are people saying close to the programs? And we try and bring you that whenever we can. The undercurrent with Auburn is they are essentially, the old guy that you watch on the surveillance cameras who, putters his way through the red light and he makes it through fine and there's a 15-car pileup behind him. Or that happens 3 or 4 times and he just keeps making his way through there. That's kind of Auburn right now. They tense their body up for the wreck and they close their eyes and they made it through. And then they made it through again. And you're like, how did we not just end up in that pileup? Who cares? Keep going. Oh, another one. Oh, we made it through that one too. Oh, keep going. So here they are. A lot of people argue should be 1-4, whatever. They're not. And so, you can make that argument all you want to, but what does it mean for the future? Because it's really irrelevant. All that stuff's in the past. I'm going to circle back to that in a second. As for the undercurrent with LSU, obviously they have not been happy thus far about their defensive performance or lack thereof down there, but all of a sudden they had an impromptu bye week, and then they came out of it and they skull-drugged South Carolina. Okay, people beat South Carolina all the time, to be frank. So that's not necessarily a season saver, but what you're wondering now, the undercurrent at LSU is, was that a firecracker going off and it's just kind of be its own little thing and it won't matter towards the end of the year? Or was it a fuse lit that could lead to something bigger? That's the backdrop with which this game will be played. The LSU quarterback situation, TJ Finley was the big headline down there after he stepped in for Miles Brennan and performed pretty admirably, I'd have to say. Last Saturday, they think that Miles Brennan will be able to play. That's very much up in the air. That's a 50-50 deal. Ed Orgeron has been non-committal on that. I don't think he knows. I don't think he's really hiding anything. I just don't think he knows. As for the Auburn side of things, they lose Brandon Council. That's a name you probably don't know. Well, that was a starting guard for them. And it is the worst time, even though there is no good time to lose starters. It's the worst time. They had finally gotten to a spot at Auburn where they had musical chairs and injuries and guys having to sit out and whatnot. They had finally had a couple of weeks where they were getting to practice and play with the same starting 5. And then, boom, down goes a starting guard. And this was already a big question mark unit and will continue to be this entire year for this team. So let me switch back as we start to preview this thing to the Auburn should be 1-4 crowd. I understand the points you're making. I agree with a lot of your points. But my point is, this is a game preview for a game that hasn't happened yet. So we can do commentary on all that stuff, and believe me, we have. How does it impact the future? What impact does that have on the future? Because if you believe that means they're not very good, then okay, I have good news for you. There are people in the desert, or it's legal in Tennessee now, so you can come over to 24/7 Sports office and we'll log on and you can lay a paycheck or two on LSU -3. But yet, as sure as the sun's going to come up in the morning, fingers crossed, I get this from people. Oh, Auburn should be 1-4. Okay, what are you trying to tell me? Well, I don't really know. It's like, what are you making the statement for? Like, if you're telling me that means they're not good, just bet the house on LSU. So I don't know what it means. That's the point. It's totally detached from the future. It could be that has bought them time and some things that maybe shouldn't have gone their way did go their way, and now it bought them enough time to maybe find an offensive identity, and so we'll see. It's ellipses, ... to be determined. But there is a certain fear, and I can tell you from being in the Southeastern Conference for quite a while, there's a certain fear and a subconscious concern that people always have with these two teams. With Auburn, it's purely voodoo. People believe in this down here, and I'm not so sure I disagree with them. There are things that extend beyond the realm of the explainable that have happened in fortuitous nature for Auburn football over the years. Most of the time it's at home. Last week it happened on the road, but there are just things that happen. It's Halloween season, there are just things that happen. And what makes you nervous is when they start benefiting from it, oh boy, well, they should have lost some stuff, but they didn't. Now they're about to peel something off on us, aren't they? That's the concern people have. They cannot erase their memory. It's there. As for LSU, they look bad early in the year, but if you haven't played them yet, there's this fear subconsciously, way in the back of your mind, of the fact that you know they still got a locker room loaded with athletes. And if they ever get it in gear, there's this DNA, this identity that LSU plays with, where no one down here ever looks at LSU, I don't care what their record is, and says, well, that'll be a pretty easy win. No one looks at LSU like that. They know the racehorses they have in that locker room. Doesn't matter what Missouri did to them. Doesn't matter what Mike Leach did to them. When you play them down the road, stands to reason they probably won't put that product on the field. So let's talk about this game. Auburn is probably going to tilt this thing 2-to-1, run-to-pass ratio. I see no reason to think otherwise. They kind of did it last week. You saw LSU score 52 points last week, right? You saw them run it up on South Carolina, and that's great. And they had a good offensive day. Here's what I think Gus Malzahn watched that film and he saw. He saw a kick return for LSU. He saw a pick six for LSU. He also saw LSU go 8 for 10 on third down, and he sees the fact that LSU is leading the league in sacks right now. He also is not dumb. He knows the limitations on his quarterback, Bo Nix. Does that sound like a formula that makes you want to put the ball in the air a whole lot? Seth Williams or not? I don't think so. Now, as sure as I say that, I think LSU is going to do the exact same thing. Last week, I wrote it down. LSU was a 54-21 run-to-pass ratio last week. It's going to be a very run-heavy game. And if the defensive fronts had stiffened at all this year, I think the under would be extremely attractive in this thing. It's 65.5 right now. Clock is winding all day long in this game. So I'm not so sure we may not go back to that under. I'd love for it to creep up a little bit. We got to get some value out of that thing. But LSU, as I said, 54-21 run-to-pass ratio. Kentucky, Georgia, South Carolina, Ed Orgeron watches those teams that have already played Auburn, and they all have one thing in common. They just ran straight at Auburn. This is the first time, as I've told you before, in quite a while, where the game plan to attack the Auburn defense is just run right up the middle of the Auburn defense. You never, ever say that about them. Some teams have had success doing it this year. Couple of questions before we move to the game capsule and a pick here. How frequently, mentioned Seth Williams there, how frequently will Auburn feel comfortable targeting him? Got to imagine that's a lot of Stingley versus Williams competition Saturday. How frequently do they feel comfortable throwing to him? He's a really good contested catch guy. There are very few corners in America with better ball skills than Derek Stingley. Second question, it's two Auburn questions really. Are they going to incorporate more tempo? They didn't work at a very fast pace most of the afternoon against Ole Miss. I think both of these, there's kind of a catch-22 for both of these offensive coordinators. They know the depth situation is not the best. They know these defensive fronts are not vintage LSU or Auburn defensive fronts, but yet they're also petrified of making mistakes that end up costing a game, and a game that both programs very, very dearly need to win. I looked at this thing, Colin, let's go ahead and get ready to cue up that capsule, and I said, offensive lines. That's really where it is. LSU's offensive line, I really don't think is going to be taken advantage of by Auburn's pass rush. I don't think Auburn has an elite pass rush right now. LSU may not have a vintage elite pass rush, but there are a lot of guys like B.J. Ojulari, for instance, coming on that I think will have much more success against Auburn's offensive line Saturday afternoon. So as we look at the game capsule, and it's LSU -3, even though our in-house model has LSU -2, I'm on the other side of that. I'm up north of 3. I like LSU to win the game. I also like LSU to cover the 3. It's not an official play for us. Maybe a total, maybe a little bit later in the week. We'll see. Stay tuned for that. But I don't know. I could be dead wrong. I think LSU found a little something last week, and even if they didn't, I still think they bring enough into this game to win. I just don't think there's enough juice offensively for Auburn, and I really don't trust that offensive line situation. I think there's enough disruptors in LSU's, especially that linebacker core now, defensive ends and whatnot. I think there are enough to force some critical errors that end up being the difference in that game.